So hi, this is Jay Shepley. I'm Member Engagement Manager with CNU. Congress for New Urbanism is an international nonprofit organization working to help build vibrant communities where people have diverse choices for how they live, work, and get around. And we believe that well-designed cities and neighborhoods are crucial for health, economy, and the environment. And on today's member-led webcast, we have joining us Jeff Speck, a city planner and urban designer who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. And most people know Jeff as the author of Walkable City, which got a lot of people reading about our issues, and it found a way to really reach a larger audience. And Jeff actually works a lot with trying to solve and figure out ways that we can engage the larger movement with new urbanism. And his latest book, Walkable City Rules, just came out last month. And I should also mention that Jeff is a CNU Charter Award winner. So welcome today, and thanks for joining us.
There's the bug. I've won a few charter awards. Most of them were with DPZ. So I was at Duane Plater Zyberk for 10 years and worked on 40 or so of their projects, and I believe those were the awards that I got. But nothing better than charter award. There's no higher honor. As far as I'm concerned, there's no higher honor.
So I want to just talk a lot about your book today and some other topics because it's so timely. And I just wanted to ask, how does Walkable City Rules differ from your book, The Walkable City? Is there a big difference in the audience that this one is geared to?
Yeah. So you kind of hinted at the trajectory of my work and my writing until now. I wrote Suburban Nation with Andres and Liz because I had heard them tell that story. And it was actually back in 1988. And I heard Andres give his classic, towns versus sprawl talk. And I was like, wow, this is such an incredible story. It makes me want to dedicate my career to these issues. And it's particularly the way that it was presented by Andres, it's just publicly accessible. And I've always been interested personally in that intersection between design and society. My undergraduate thesis was called The Architectural Gap, and it was about the fact that professionals seem to like one kind of architecture and the public seem to like another, and what do we do about that, right? But when I heard this story from Andres and Liz, I was like, wow, this is such a great story. And it took many years to finally create Suburban Nation, but I saw my goal in the movement, and in some ways I still do, as to helping to popularize these ideas and to find them a larger audience and to bridge that gap between what we do and understand as professionals and what regular folks who may not have the orientation or the training or whatever, how they're viewing the work that we do, but also the quality of their own communities. So Walkable City was kind of the ultimate attempt with a Main Street publisher, and good connections to the places that would, NPR and other places that would really promote these ideas, to write a literary nonfiction work, right, that would attract a general readership in every way. And Witold Rupczynski, who's probably the most prolific and best-selling architectural writer there is, and he writes about urbanism too in some great books. When we were working on Suburban Nation, Witold said, Jeff, no pictures. And I said, why? And he said, because if there's pictures, it'll be in the back of the store with the design books. And if there's no pictures, it'll be in the front of the store with the current affairs books. Now, Suburban Nation really needed pictures. And fortunately, due to the great publisher we had and other things, it made it to the front of the store. But I remembered that advice. And also, the town versus sprawl story that's in Suburban Nation is so visual. Whereas the story about why walkability is so important and what makes a walkable place and what doesn't have to be as visual. And I set myself the goal with Walkable City to write a book that had no pictures, just so it would be certain to reach that larger audience. And I think most of our audience knows it, but it's a good looking book that is it's a book. It's just a book. And if you're a designer and you went to architecture school, which means you look at the pictures and you don't read the words, this may not be the book for you. But it did manage to do what we had hoped, which is, or I say I had hoped. I was the one hoping the most, which was to to engage a general audience in this conversation. But it's become a tool, I think, most people in CNU, I think, have read it by this point, but it's become a tool that I use, and I know other new urbanists use, to engage their communities in these conversations. But there's a lot of places I go where before I land, 10, 20, even like 90 copies of the book have been distributed that happened in Tulsa, to the people in the town. And when enough people read it, they're ready to do the work. But Walkable City Rules, which is looming here, the cover tells you how different a book it is, which is that a couple things. First of all, it's, yes, it has pictures and diagrams, and charts and that sort of thing. So every page has something visual. But that's because it's really not aimed for the front of the store. And if it ends up in the front of the store, that's great. I'm hoping that we have well, I'm not hoping for a smaller readership, but I think honestly, I'm hoping for a smaller and deeper readership, which is that this is the book then that's for people who are doing the work. And so most of the places I lecture, I'm like, I want you to buy my new book, but maybe the older book is the one that's more appropriate if you are trying to learn the fundamentals here, or perhaps trying to convince other people to care about these issues. But if you're actually doing the work, the complaints I heard about Walkable City was that, it got people very excited to do the work. It argued very effectively for better places in the exact way that you described in the introduction, which was it made economic arguments, it made health arguments, and it made environmental arguments for more walkable places. And then it talked about how to do that. But I heard stories of people who, they'd go to meetings, they'd hold the book up and make their point, and then they'd feel, I hate to use the word, but they'd feel a little bit stranded moving forward because the book didn't have enough detail, about exactly how to design and how to measure and how to prove the sort of stuff that we were advocating for. So Walkable City Rules has the subtitle, 101 Steps to Making Better Places, and it's literally 101 rules. And each rule has a number and a headline and a subheadline and then a text and images, and then at the bottom there's an actual rule.
Right.
So this one that I've chosen randomly is understand network function. Choose porous networks over dendritic sprawl and take advantage of their virtues. And there's a long explanation about the differences, but the bottom says, Rule 36, in all new development, build a porous network of streets and blocks rather than branching dendritic systems. When considering changes to individual streets, understand that traffic within a network can shift to parallel routes. Because very often, and we talk about this in the rule, very often when you're trying to figure out whether you can do a road diet or add bike lanes to a street or remove a lane in some way, people say, oh, but that street has, 16,000 cars per day. I say, well, yeah, but there's parallel roads. And didn't you just close that street because there was a gas leak? And did the city shut down, right? And so people often forget that at least in porous networks, the roads all rely on and relate to each other. So this rule makes that clear. But you can see from just a little bit I read, it's much more technical. And I like to say it weaponizes Walkable City for deployment in the field.
That's an interesting point. And we've been talking about that at the office and talking about some of the differences that, maybe Walkable City Rules is catered a little bit more towards practitioners. But I actually really found it amazing from the perspective of an armchair urbanist. I'm not an architect or a planner, but I'm very fascinated by all of these, different practical ways. And there's a real focus on that with CNUs. Let's look at real places, real examples, and real tactics. And from my experience with being on charrettes, I've really learned that these types of diagrams, illustrations, photos, they can be incredibly helpful when you go to solve a problem. And you talk in the book about the difference between solving problems and short-term gains and then dreaming bigger. And I think the book definitely has a whole lot of both. It's really enjoyable to read. And I do encourage everybody to go out and pick it up if they haven't already. So I think that's a great segue into this next question. And it's a bit of a different question, and it covers one of the bigger issues that we're focused on as a movement. That's addressing issues of displacement, gentrification, justice, and equity. And we found that your book did a really wonderful job of addressing some of these issues with pragmatic tactics. And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that you've actually been able to address these issues.
So Rule 14 is fight displacement. And with this book, I really did try to be comprehensive, and no one book can claim to do this, but I really tried to create the only book that someone would need to do the work that we do.
Yeah.
And that meant that I had to learn about a bunch of stuff that I wasn't expert in. I think one of the weaknesses of the new urbanism, and I point to myself, among others, is that it was principally the brainchild of architects and designers who, very much like the City Beautiful movement, which has been faulted for the same, we all love the City Beautiful movement, but it's been faulted for the same challenges. We grew out of design and beauty and the physical form of the city. And it was a necessary corrective to many years of planning, which forgot all about that, right? And the reason that one of the key reasons that pieces of cities that were being designed prior to the new urbanism movement were not working was because the physical and the design aspect had been forgotten and wasn't getting enough attention. But because we're so focused on design, we hadn't, and I would say it's not our nature necessarily. Some of us, yes. Some of us like me, maybe no. It's not our nature to pay enough attention to some of these other issues like displacement, gentrification, and attainable housing and homelessness and other stuff that have been a part of the planning discussion for some time and need to remain a significant part of the planning discussion. So I actually, and another thing I spent a lot of time looking into, because it had always been a concern of mine, but I never focused much on it, was just stopping deaths in streets, right? And simple things like speed cameras and 20 is plenty rules and other stuff like that many of us who came at this from a strictly kind of architectural urban design perspective now find that we can do the most good the most quickly just by just saving the lives of pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers too, right? So we kind of had to expand the orientation. But when you do research into gentrification, there's some pretty clear stuff that appears immediately. Strategies that some of us have participated in. That what's lacking is just people being aware of and pursuing these what's the word, strategies. So in my rule 14 called Fight Displacement, first I talk about the distinction between gentrification and displacement and how it's important to use the right words, because actually gentrification is pretty inevitable, but displacement is not. And then I lay out the four most effective tools, very briefly, but enough to let you know, okay, I can now go and research this and actually do it in my community. The four most effective tools that have been successful in communities for limiting displacement. The first is a community land trust, like was pioneered in Burlington, Vermont. The second is turning renters into owners, which I have a personal story about that I'll tell in a second. The third that a number of communities like Boston and Philadelphia use is to offer property tax freezes to existing abutters. And then finally, supporting the production of attainable housing. And here I make the point that there's actually a bit of a misleading voice that you hear in these conversations, where it's very easy just to say supply curve, demand curve. If we make more housing, housing will be cheaper. And I myself am probably guilty of saying that. But what the data now shows is that if you go into a community that's gentrifying and you build a large development of entirely luxury, which is of course anything, pretty nice, entirely luxury housing, it will not help with stopping displacement. It's only when you introduce housing at mixed price points and for a variety of users. Because if all you're doing is introducing luxury housing, then that does create a sort of cachet to the neighborhood that makes displacement more likely. But the interesting story I had about turning renters into owners was I did a vision plan that eventually became a master plan with Torty Gallus that eventually became a development for the Wyandanch stop, which is the poorest stop on the Long Island Railroad in New York. And I was amazed. It was a very forward-thinking Steve Ballone, who's now a county executive there. He was effectively the mayor of this community, called a supervisor. And he had just extremely savvy staff for a relatively small community, Babylon, New York, in which Wyandanch was a neighborhood. And I was amazed as I was refining, in their offices, refining the actual design of the vision plan. This is like well before they'd even gotten into the master plan. There were people in the next cubby on the phone calling up existing renters and offering them a program that would turn them into owners, where they could pay with city subsidies, essentially, that were going to be paid for by the developers who were creating the project. With city subsidy, they could effectively, they'd be paying no more per month, and they'd be trading their renting profile in this soon-to-be gentrifying neighborhood into an ownership profile, and therefore benefit from the increase in value. And that's a great example of a city taking the initiative. The biggest challenge that I try to solve in the book is to make people more aware of these strategies. But the problem that the book doesn't solve is that a lot of communities just don't care. And I'm not sure what to say about that. But when it comes to a couple things, providing attainable housing, right? Housing for at a mix of price points, providing family housing, because a lot of communities don't want to be burdened by school children, taking care of homelessness, which we talk about also in the book, but also fighting gentrification. A lot of cities have kind of a moral vacuum in their leadership, the city council and the, whatever the development review board may be, that they actually don't care. And I'm not sure what to say about that. They don't feel that it's their obligation to, help society as a whole by doing anything except increasing their tax base.
What do you think about inclusionary zoning? Is there a way to sort of codify some of these, things so that we can make people care?
So doing smart inclusionary zoning, and I say that's not a technical term, it's a term I use. Doing smart inclusionary zoning is another rule in the book. And we've learned now from dozens and dozens of these programs, hundreds of them, that there are mistakes made and there are good versions and bad versions. Some of the early versions of inclusionary zoning, for example, only required the developers to keep the units at below market rate until the person moved out. So of course you had this perverse incentive to actually even torture the resident so they would want to move out. That's one of about 8 things that you need to make sure you don't do wrong that I talk about in the book. But inclusionary zoning, it's funny, in Walkable City, I made a statement that I thought was kind of wrong, which I was regretting, which was that there are 2 readily available tools that are becoming more and more used to increase the supply of attainable housing in our communities, and they are inclusionary zoning and granny flats. And, neither of them are all that powerful, and neither of them have the effectiveness of providing housing for those that need them, like the old programs of, Section 8 housing and vouchers and all the other stuff we used to do when we as a society felt that people actually kind of deserved housing, and we were going to help them do that. So I was regretting, in a sense, being so gung-ho about those 2 strategies. Since the book was written, though, we've seen a ton of success of very well-organized, or I should say smartly run inclusionary zoning programs. But the huge surprise has been the granny flats, which I kind of felt was like I felt subsequently that maybe I'd fallen prey to this new urbanist fetish, because we all love them and we've been promoting them for 20 years, and Andres and Liz longer than that. But what happened was that communities started, and this is one of the rules in the book, to create a Granny Flats program. Communities started creating Granny Flats programs that both allowed them and incentivized them even, and then helped you to design them well in existing single family communities. And hundreds of them are being built. And then the state of California went so far as to outlaw all of the local Granny Flat ordinances so they could make a state ordinance with many fewer barriers, much more incentives, or I should say fewer disincentives. And they went from doing a couple hundred Granny Flats in a year to thousands in a year. Just in LA, the data's in the book, I'm going to get it wrong, but they went from like 100 applications one year to like 2,000 the next year because the state changed the rules. And all of a sudden you see a significant impact from these two. Unfortunately, we don't have many larger state and certainly federal programs that are providing housing more directly, but these limited tools have actually shown some real impact.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you mentioned ADUs and Granny Flats. That issue is just absolutely on fire right now, something that we're all sort of concerned with and interested in. And I actually really am hoping that at CNU we can engage, the tiny house movement and more organizations that are interested. We have a lot of wonderful people that are having some great success with this out in the real world. So that's such a hot topic, and it's something that people should check out on cnu.org and check out what some of our key leaders are saying about that. It's quite an interesting debate and subject. As a membership engagement manager at CNU, a lot of my work actually has to do with finding ways to expand the tent and find new ways to engage a larger audience with new urbanism. And you've had a lot of success with this, obviously.
I really do see it as my role in this movement to try and broaden the tent. And the Walkable City, just the idea, I wish I had a better recall, but I think it kind of happened accidentally. But the reorienting of all the work that we do, that you can call new urbanism, you can call it traditional town planning, you can call it best practices in urban design, but calling it walkability, right? And I don't really say walkable planning or walkability planning, but just reframing the argument in terms of walkability, which I didn't invent, but it was just something that a lot of us, I guess, stumbled onto at the same time, has been extremely instrumental in broadening the tent. But then you ask the question, how can we get more people to care, or what are the issues we can raise to do that? And we already mentioned three, which I spend a good part of Walkable City talking about, which is engaging with economists, particularly kind of real estate economists like Chris Lineberger and Joe Courtwright, who studies these issues, about what are the tremendous costs to our society of not being walkable, and then what's the tremendous profits to be made, frankly, by making more walkable places. And of course, how cities that want to be more vital generate more patents per capita and do all the other things that are a mark of success, will be more walkable places. The health arguments are extremely compelling, and I think CNU has done a great job, and our members have done a great job in building relationships and partnerships with people in the epidemiological space about how important walking is and what that means in terms of the design of our communities. The best book in that regard is from 2004. It's called Urban Sprawl and Public Health by Frank Frumkin and Dick Jackson, who are all great speakers if you ever get a chance to see them. And just making these arguments, hearing doctors say, wow, we have the first generation of kids who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents because we've engineered out of existence the useful walk, right? That's a super powerful argument. And then I think we could do a better job reaching out to environmentalists, but the environmentalism movement has reversed itself in a sense, in a way that's very beneficial to our objectives, which is that they now realize that cities are the solution. And for so many years, cities were the problem, right? But the key issue that, don't measure carbon per square mile, measure carbon per household. And when you measure carbon per household, it's so clear that the more urban, the more dense you are, the lighter footprint each of us is having. But those were the three categories that you mentioned. It's the 3 categories that I framed in Walkable City, but there are 2 more now. And the first 5 rules of the book are sell walkability on health, wealth, and climate change. But I added 2 more based on things people told me. The first, it's actually the last one, but I'm going to reverse the order I described them to you. People brought up right away. In fact, Mike Watkins said to me, as soon as, when I was writing Walkable City, he's like, what about community? Like, isn't the creation of community so important in one of the things that we achieved by making more walkable places? But I didn't have enough evidence. I didn't have enough data to make it a whole chapter of the book. And I felt that it was kind of a softer conversation and not as hard-hitting as the other ones. But it turns out there is a lot of great evidence. You know, Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone talks about how, like, every 10 minutes that you add to your commute, you're 10% less likely to participate in community activities. There's a study I cite in the book that says in New Hampshire, they surveyed 700 residents of 20 neighborhoods split between more and less walkable in Manchester and Portsmouth. And quote, those living in more walkable neighborhoods trusted their neighbors more, participated in community projects, clubs, and volunteering more, and described television as their major form of entertainment less than survey participants living in walkable neighborhoods. And then there's this amazing work done by Donald Appleyard, where he mapped the social lives of people in these 3 different conditions, basically identical blocks, but how much traffic is there on the street? And here I'll do a tiny reading from the book because it's fun. It says, comparing streets that were essentially identical but for the number of cars they carried, Appleyard found that most people living on light traffic streets considered their entire street to be their home territory, while most people on heavy traffic streets only felt at home within their own buildings or apartments. More remarkably, while people on light traveled streets counted on average 3.0 friends, people on busy streets averaged only 0.9 friends. That's hardly the best ad copy. Heavy traffic for those times when you want to have slightly less than 1 friend. But then, so that's the community argument. Then there's actually some amazing, rule 4, there's some amazing equity arguments. And we didn't talk about this enough at all in Walkable City, or I think as CNU, we don't talk about it enough. And obviously there's fears of gentrification when you make a place better. And there's fears, legitimate fears, that because walkability is so desired, that any place that is walkable or you make more walkable becomes more expensive and exclusive, because in America, you know, money talks. And if you don't have money, you walk, right? So that is a real issue that we need to counter with some very important evidence, or I should say just arguments. You know, first that 1/3 of Americans don't drive, and, you know, they shouldn't have to be second-class citizens in our environment. Of course, how walkability gives the elderly a new lease on life. Walkability gives children independence. Transit disproportionately serves poor and minority people, obviously. Poor, elderly, and non-white pedestrians are disproportionately killed in traffic. Obviously, walkability improvements disproportionately help the differently abled, who need, you know, good space to roll around and get around in different ways. But the one that's the most kind of counterintuitive, probably, is that walking and bicycling disproportionately serve the poor and minorities. And particularly with bicycling, people think of it as this elite activity. You know, they picture the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra, as your typical cyclist. The latest data shows that fully 39% of bicycle commuters come from the poorest 25% of our population. So when you put a bike lane in, or you do something else to make biking less treacherous, you're actually helping those who have the least in our society. So I think it's really important, in light of the legitimate fears that we have about walkability being this elite luxury good, that we make a point that you know, less dependence on driving and more safe walking and biking is really serving the whole society, but particularly those with less, you know, demographically more challenged folks.
Thanks again, Jeff. With that, I hope everyone can go out and get Walkable City Rules and Walkable City and Suburban Nation if you haven't already. And thanks again for your time today and going over some of the finer points in your new book.
Well, thank you for the questions and the interest, and I'll see you at CNU.
Awesome. We'll